I'm your host, not Jason Miles, and welcome back to This is Revolution. Peace of the mods, peace of the chat. This week, we somehow went from ranking Sherlock Holmes portrayals to debtor power to the history behind an abandoned McDonald's, which frankly is a very This is Revolution thing to do. If you missed those shows, check them out after this one. After this one. If you're watching and not subscribed, join our nearly 21,000 subscribers. It's free. If you're already subscribed, thank you. If you're not, Jason says you're stealing. I would never say that. Also, we're definitely not a cult. With that being said, I'm M. Toussaint, and your requested, nay, demanded, a very special What Fresh Hell Part 2 Electric Boogaloo awaits you. Today, we're taking a trip around the global south using 4 recent environmental stories to examine how climate crises intersect with war, global commodity production, unequal urban infrastructure, and even the supposedly green transition. Let's get to it. Please welcome the global north's very own Deep State Cuba.
Hello there.
I'm like, let me do this real quick here. Scrambling.
Polite applause. That's a very global north thing.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm going to put this up and then get out of your way. What is
Okay. Well, it's worth putting it in the context of the other great directional identity, right? We talk about the South, we talk about the West. The global North is less of a thing conceptually. It only exists really in discussions of the global South as the contrasting counterpart. And the East has fallen out of favor. That was very much a Cold War formulation, the East versus West. But then it got very quickly complicated by the fact that you have multiple flavors of East, right? There was the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, if we're just sticking to communist countries, but turns out the East is a pretty big beast. Where do these terms come from? Well, 200-300 years ago, people weren't using this directional terminology in discussing the world, except in the most poetic sense, right? Like if you go all the way back to the Rashidun Caliphate or Charlemagne, they liked the idea of there being 4 great empires of the cardinal directions, right? There's an emperor in the West, which is the Holy Roman Emperor, an emperor in the East, which is the Caliph, and then they would fill in the North and South usually with mythical, semi-mythical figures. Sometimes Prester John, the Christian emperor attributed to Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in the medieval imagination. Sometimes that would be the emperor of the South. But, like the emperor of the North might as well have been Ned Stark, right? It was that kind of age. When Europeans start discovering, right, going out and filling in the areas of the map, begin to try to approach their relations with the rest of the world more systematically, the very first thing that they reach to, a dividing principle, is of course religion. Right? They distinguish between Christendom and people going to hell. That gets complicated by the fact that with the Reformation, there's more than one Christendom. With the schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, likewise, you break that into many, many different pieces, often warring with one another, with different states, with different interests. You also recognize that the non-Christian world comes in flavors. Indigenous cultures in North America, South America, are quite different than Islam. And eventually, when Marco Polo makes it far enough east, they're like, oh, you mean you have religions here coexisting? You've got like many different gods. You worship your ancestors. Shit gets weird once you go far enough east. That fell out of favor also with rising secularism following the French Revolution. For a while, there was this disputed field. How do we talk about the difference between us and the rest of the world? Because there was a sense that Europeans, as bloody as they were in their own domestic conflicts, there were some similarities, some fundamentally undeniable characteristics that they shared. Religion being one, this historical association with classical Greece and especially Rome, the alphabet, the language, these kinds of things, the food, the climate. So first, there's an attempt to distinguish this as civilization versus everything else, right? Where the people with culture, our culture is culture, everything else is barbarism. That doesn't last very long, or rather it gets contested. I mean, to a certain extent, lasts to this day, but that gets challenged by different ways of looking at things. One being a racialized version, right? Like that all of the buildings and the language and everything else is just an extension, a manifestation of race genius, which is fundamentally biological. Obviously, that has a very long and illustrious pedigree, but gets crucially falsified between 1939 and 1945. Instead, what you have developing is this notion of a civilizational West, which is not biological, which is based on a combination of a certain kind of European tradition, but also has these Enlightenment values, democracy, human rights, etc., etc. This is one reason why the whole Western civilization discourse right now is weird, because when you hear Christian nationalists, white nationalists, Elon Musk, saying that we need to preserve Western civilization, it's like, well, what the hell are you talking about? Are you talking about Goethe? Are you talking about cathedrals? Are you talking about the Latin Mass? Are you talking about constitutional government? Because it doesn't sound like you're talking about any of those things. It sounds like you're talking about like pale ass demyelinated DNA. That's essentially what it's become. The West was invented as a category to get away from racialized notions of belonging to this transatlantic European community, one which is assimilationist, civic, right, non-biological, as opposed to the Nazi master race, Aryan, white civilization talk, to a means of smuggling it back in a respectable form. There was another path taken that wasn't racial, which was developmental. And we talked about advanced countries, civilized countries. You didn't say civilized and barbaric anymore because that's a little triggering. And instead you talked advanced backwards, which is not good, but it's at least better. Then there was an attempt to try to map Western identity as like a cultural, political block on top of economic development. That became challenged by the rise of the Soviet Union. where it looked like there were two roughly equivalent technologically advanced nodes over a global post-colonial colonial population that was at a very, very low stage of technical and technological development, right? And we're talking about periods with landlines where roads don't connect major cities across Africa, across Latin America, where many, many people are living at extremely low level of material sophistication, or at least with access to industrial technology. People could live very rich lives here, but they didn't necessarily have access to cell phones. Literacy could be a problem, right? What we would consider to be the foundations, or rather what were considered to be at the time the foundations of modern society, just weren't available to most people. They existed in the communist East, and they existed in the capitalist West. And somebody noticed that these two blocks, the one thing they had in common was they were both in the northern hemisphere, and they were both sort of temperate region areas. When the notion of third worldism, right, that the developing world would have a single block, single political identity, when that faded because of the successful sort of entry of first the United States and then the Soviet Union into the post-colonial countries, polarizing governments, and essentially forcing many of them major regional countries to pick sides. The notion of third worldism faded until it became, again, as with the West, the third world starts as a concept that's promoted by the leaders of African countries, Kwame Nkrumah, Sukarno from Indonesia, Nehru from India, as their own language to describe their own situation between these poles, between the capitalist and the communist worlds, and instead becomes a term of abuse that just means primitive, bad, something we don't like, something foreign and smelly, right? That's the term that's the way that the term survives to this day, right? Like your racist uncle might still be referring to third world people, third world problems. You hear lamentations from reactionaries all the time that Great Britain, the US are turning into third world countries, which is fantastically ironic because thanks to the developmentalism of the last 30 years, many third world countries are actually extremely nice places. You wouldn't associate them with this kind of total badness, right? That the term is used to denote. And instead, what's replaced the notion of the third world, because that's defunct as a block, and now we don't really have a communist second world anymore to contrast against the Washington capitalist liberal pole, was the idea of a global South. That was the post-colonial space. It replaced the language of developing countries, and instead represented all of those areas where you didn't have the first wave legacies, the legacies of first wave and second wave industrialization. So the EU, the United States, Canada, obviously global north. Russia, the post-Soviet space, also global north. Developed East Asia, global north. Australia and New Zealand, despite being about as far south as you can get, also the global north. But Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, these are the areas that could be put together as the global South. And there's wildly different levels of development, sophistication, and political orientation in those areas. You've got places like El Salvador, where Bukele is pro-MAGA, he's accepting people that Trump wants to dump on him. Very right-wing president, Javier Milei, similarly. You also have left-wing movements, right? Communist states like Vietnam, global South. You have Islamist governments, the Taliban, the Islamic Republic of Iran. You have militant secular governments. Like, I mean, I don't want to say, I don't want to repeat myself, but again, like the Vietnamese secular developmentalists, um, you have post-colonial states as well as states that had never been colonized. Uh, and this broad group is characterized by still having developmental issues for the most part, having very different developmental priorities than the countries of the global north, and their exclusion from certain nodes of global power. Of course, with the Iran war and with the change in uh, the distribution of power and influence, the destruction of certain institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, thanks to Trump, and the elevation of other ones based in China, all of that is becoming much more complicated. But right now, the global south is basically how we talk about all of the places that need a visa to get to Europe.
Question. Quick question. Um, I thought the second world, the developing world, was what we're considering the second world now.
So the whole three worlds concept is directly related to the Cold War. First world, the United States, Western Europe. The second world, Soviet Union and its satellites. In the early days after World War II, and remember, World War II did not end European colonialism. When you look at a map of 1945, the British Empire is still there and it's still huge. Most of Africa, India, Malaysia, the sun still doesn't set. There's still a French Empire that has West Africa, Central Africa, Algeria at this point, still French. You have the Belgian Congo, the Dutch East Indies. So after World War II, when the Cold War is beginning to ramp up, first and second means communist, non-communist. And non-communist usually means imperialized by the West. That becomes defunct when you no longer have a communist second world. Then at that point, what do we do with Russia? How do we describe it? How do we talk about it? And Russia sort of lost its third world and developing card because of Soviet imperialism, right? It might be a developing country by GDP per capita, by these kinds of indicators, only after the transition from communism, right? That creates just a massive collapse economically of the old Soviet states, but also undoes the power of the USSR. For a long time, Russia is sort of too broken and too beaten down to do good old-fashioned imperializing. Nonetheless, at this point, Russia is absolutely unwilling to describe itself as a third world country. It's loath to talk about itself as a developing country even. And that makes the old categories a little untenable. And I think that it's not coincidental that the rise of the concept of the global south is really a post-Cold War phenomenon. Nobody talks about the global south as long as there's a USSR. At that point, third world still kind of meant something, but at this point, that language, right? The world has changed so much that those categories no longer make sense. And it's hard to find categories that do make sense because history is a moving target. It used to be that there was this notion that the West was an unshakable bloc, right? That between NATO, the EU, the long-standing transatlantic alliance, the fact that we're largely still talking about white people or countries that were founded by white people and then might be turning multicultural, but assimilate into a European language speaking dominant culture, that was a solid, permanent thing. And what we're seeing now, thanks to Donald Trump's aggressive and destructive diplomacy, the West was never that locked in. And it looks like he's accomplishing something that no previous communist power, no previous force ever managed to achieve, which is to shatter the NATO alliance, break it apart. And all of a sudden we have two Wests, right? The US and what we could call the constellation of middle powers that Carney and the EU are trying to develop as an alternative pole. And now it's a struggle. We'll see how long the global South has in it before we start talking about the global Southwest, the global Southeast, the global North by Northeast. One of the developments in a multipolar world is that you're going to have to come up. You're going to have to learn about all the poles. It's going to be more than one or two, I'm afraid.
Well, you're our pole.
Oh
Um,
shucks.
I just want to show real quick because I did get us a map just so you have a visual for the YouTube viewers. Sorry, audio viewers, but you had to visualize Cuba's explanation. They have Antarctica here as part of the global south, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and like I said, Australia and New Zealand very clearly in the global north. Japan and South Korea were other edge cases that created this term because they're not Western countries in the racial and cultural sense. They're deeply connected with the American-backed security model, and they're rich. At this point, frankly, like the map had China as part of the global South, but I wonder about that. Right, the Chinese priorities and issues are very different now than those of poorer countries that struggled out the resources to deal with the bigger powers, right? China's kind of graduated out of the global south.
Hmm. Well, here to help celebrate that graduation is the green homie. Only I can call him Sparky. His name is Scott Parkin. To you, please welcome Scott Parkin.
Hey there. Good morning.
Hello again, Scott.
Hey Kuba, how you doing?
All right, all right.
Slightly delayed applause that time. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. We actually had a question from the last episode that I wanted to bring back before we get into today's stories. I don't see the person who asked that question, but we're going to ask it in good faith and hope you guys can answer it because I don't know the answer. So last time we discussed the heat wave and fires in Europe. Chat regular Virtuoso asked, at what temperature do trees ignite? Anyone? Please answer that.
So there's a difference between. I'm just Googling the combustion point of wood. A typical wood fire burns at temperatures between 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 and 1500, 260 to 850 Celsius. So if you're counting on temperature alone to ignite wood,
Mm-hmm.
you need a lot, right? Um, Fire generally spreads horizontally. It spreads by flame, not by increasing the temperature enough so that things combust on their own. But yeah, it's pretty hot. It gets pretty hot.
It's pretty hot. Scott, would you like to jump in here too? You know about trees. You hug them.
Yeah, I do. I've spent a lot of time defending trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm less up on the I guess the science of what it takes to ignite trees. I will say that the one thing I'll throw out there just just something to say is that we're seeing a lot more trees burn, and part of that is just because of the conditions that are created by the climate crisis and the fossil fuel consumption in the mostly in the global north, actually a lot in the United States. And so it's just like I think it's like an important thing to remember that, like, trees are burning, and it's not necessarily like some sort of like natural phenomenon. It's actually something that we as humans are contributing a lot to.
Well,
Mm,
I'd
good
also
point.
point out that um, when we talk about wildfires, and that's
Hmm.
one aspect, but wood is also a fuel source. It
Right.
gets deliberately, you have deforestation just for often cooking fuel. And
Hmm.
that is common across the global south, or certain pockets of the global south. It's extremely prevalent because there aren't alternatives to wood or charcoal. And in those cases, in those areas, ironically, like introducing propane might be a better way to cook and reduce the level of deforestation associated with that. Um, but what we're seeing in terms of wildfires, that's very closely tied to climate change. That's very closely tied to fossil fuel consumption. And when we look at the big polluters, well, obviously it's the global north, but I would complicate that a little because you have areas like China, some of Southeast Asia as well, where the emissions are produced locally, but the
Hmm.
goods are then exported globally,
Hmm.
not just to the West either, but increasingly as there's south-south trade between China, Africa, Latin America, you name it, then you've got basically China polluting for the sake of global consumption. The
Mm,
other issue there is that when you look at energy transition, it's basically China, which has this paradoxical role of producing massive amounts of green energy infrastructure every year. An entire Germany's worth of renewables goes online every year.
Hmm.
But it still mines the coal. It still produces some of the most carbon intensive energy as well. It does both. Um, and
It's an all
there's
of the above strategy.
it's an all of the above strategy, but it's an all of the above strategy to produce energy, not to offset or mitigate carbon emissions. Like that's not their goal. Their goal is economic resilience and durability, with climate part of the equation, but not the determining priority. And you can see this as well with the other sort of elephant in the room that nobody talks about, which is military production and the vast amounts of fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions associated with the operation and production of modern weapons of war. Right, the U.S. military, I think, would be the number three polluter in the world if it were its own country. No one wants to admit how polluting the defense industry and global imperialism, war in general, how big a contributor that is. You don't have. I want to push against this idea that like the average Westerner, the average citizen of the global North, is the villain in all of this. You have concentrated emissions coming from certain industries, like defense, that don't actually benefit most Westerners. And you also have concentrated emissions at the very top. Everybody who flies private is who uses private jets and this kind of travel, they are polluting at the level of thousands of regular, average, working class citizens of the global north. That's where the real concentrations of emissions are. We should do something systemically, of course,
Hmm.
but losing sight of, in some ways, this is low hanging fruit because if we could solve the big picture uh, inequality and militarism problem, then we might be able to do something about these big sources without eating into everyone's quality of life. But sorry, I've gone on.
No, it's okay. I agree. I actually think putting on the individual consumers not the way to go. And there was a recent interview with Ezra Klein and Bill McKibben where it was like this promotion of we can consume our way. If the United States just consumed our way out of the climate crisis, the way in which China is, for example, where we have this like growing renewable sector, then that will just solve all the problems. But part of what we need to be talking about is not just um, is not just how we can like replace the current energy production that's based on fossil fuels with energy production based on renewables, but we actually need to talk about how we also reduce energy production, right? And so like, you know, you know, single driver cars, for example, whether they're EVs or whether they're, gas guzzling SUVs, right? That's still not totally solving the problem. There's actually also a pretty big carbon footprint that comes from the renewable sector as well. And then there's also a lot of exploitative practices actually in the global south, some of which I think we're going to talk about today, which, are having actually have a bad impact on ecosystems and on communities and such. And so if we're back to the cars, if like we looked at more public transportation, for example, then we could actually look at how we reduce the number of single driver vehicles on the roads, right? So
I remember once talking with some consultant friends of mine and trying to think of what a global plan for development and green transition might look like. And at this point, you've already shifted so much manufacturing to China, especially, but some some of these uh, production chains, supply chains, are heavily based in Southeast Asia or India as
right,
well. The West, the whole concept was that these are going to be service post-industrial economies, lots of brain work, not much production, and that's fine. In fact, it creates an opportunity for the West to concentrate on finding new modes of consumption that could drive down emissions per capita without necessarily compromising quality of life. One thing, as you said, single occupant vehicles, they're a blight all across North America. When you look at the urbanism in Europe and the quality of life that Europeans enjoy, which is in many ways enviable compared to North America, well, there, high quality public transportation is just built in to the foundations of everyday life. It's a universal good. You see people from all social strata on the tram or the subway, especially on the train. And you have the terrestrial train system, of course, which is also world class, gets you where to go. I mean, at this point, the German trains suck because they deferred maintenance for a really long time. Now they're trying to do everything at once. But Italian trains are great. The and so there's some very low hanging adaptations which wouldn't even impede quality of life that broadened, turned into a universal model, could get us a great deal of runway for carbon emissions without compromising anybody's quality of life. It's just that um, the steps necessary to take them to get us there, well, there's powerful interests that stand to lose out of that. And at this point, right, it's like, I'm sorry, Billy, there's no money to get you to pay for your new kidney because Elon Musk needs another data center.
yeah, right. The Sun Belt cities are I live in the Bay Area now, which actually is a pocket of actually pretty good public transportation, right? In the US. But I'm originally from Texas and grew up in Dallas and lived in Houston for a long time. And when I lived in Houston as a young adult working a job, it's minimum 2 hour commute, right? Like back and forth. And those Sun Belt cities, you know, came into car culture because of lobbying in the 1950s from oil companies and from tire companies and from auto manufacturing and things like that. And so to kind of get back, that there is a class of perpetrators who are responsible for even like our current situation. And it just like kind of goes on and on. So I just want to like point.
Who
I think
framed
that's a
Roger
point.
Rabbit?
What's that?
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yeah,
The whole spoilers for a 40-year-old movie, but the whole villain, the motivation behind the destruction of Cartoon Town was to put in a freeway because Big Auto had bought the services of this like fixer, and they were going to pull up the streetcar system and force everybody into automobiles as a profit maximizing strategy. Which, apart from the cartoons, it's just a documentary.
right, exactly.
So maybe palm oil, right? From diesel fuel to fueling our bellies. Let's go back to the global south.
Right.
Indeed. Let's get back to the global south. Let's have a look at what this looks like on the ground. So Indonesia, can palm oil be made sustainable? There's our question for right now. Indonesia is the world's largest producer and exporter of palm oil, a major global commodity used in everything from food to cosmetics and biofuels. Palm oil production has historically given large scale deforestation palm oil production has historically driven large scale deforestation, particularly on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo. So, companies and governments have increasingly adopted policies designed to reduce forest loss. One of those approaches has been corporate zero deforestation commitments, or ZDCs. These are pledges that companies will not clear forests for new palm oil plantations. A new study looked at whether those commitments actually made a difference. Researchers compared Indonesian palm oil concessions connected to companies with zero deforestation pledges with concessions that were not covered by those pledges. They found that deforestation fell dramatically across both groups, but the companies with the zero deforestation commitments did not see an additional reduction in deforestation compared with companies without them. In other words, the companies largely kept their promises, but something else appears to have driven most of the overall decline. Researchers point to broader changes in the palm oil sector, including falling palm oil prices and the fact that some of the worst deforestation has already happened. So, my question is, what does this tell us about the limits of relying on corporate promises to solve environmental problems? And we'll go with you first, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say about that study is that most of the places where we've seen those corporate commitments for the um, ZDCs has been in place that actually were post deforestation, right? And
Mhm.
so uh, there's this notion of like the forest frontier, right? And so those are
Mhm.
new places where they're going in, where they're doing the deforestation and they're developing palm oil plantations. And a critical thing here is that a lot of the corporate promises are around, or the corporate pledges. I don't really want to say the promises because that actually sounds like it's something nice and sweet and things like that. But like, these corporations are not nice and sweet. The Indonesian palm oil sector in particular is pretty ruthless and is engaged in things, all kinds of human rights abuses and forced labor and that sort of thing. So a promise makes it sounds like I'm going to get a promise ring or something like that. So I just want to put that out there. But like, it's notable that they have been looking for that they look that those a lot of those pledges are actually for places that have already suffered some level of deforestation. And for the corporate pledges, we actually need to be looking at the like new untouched places that have not been deforested. There's places in East Kalimantan province and Borneo, for example, is like a place where that's where we should be getting pledges. That's not an area that's been touched yet. And so I just want to point out that there's a little bit of a flaw in that study. Um, and then the other piece is that as I'm a longtime anti-corporate campaigner, and have worked on tropical rainforest issues. I've worked on like North American fossil fuel issues and challenging the finance sector and things like that. And so that, let's call that a theory of change, right? Is that strategy to like, you know, put pressure on these companies is,
ESG it being one of the main vehicles for it, right?
yeah,
And environmental, social, and governance. The idea that that could be a certification scheme. You, as a corporate actor, as a business, you need to get above a certain score, which is assigned to you by highly paid consultants through whatever propriety black box metric they come up with. And then funds that want to address whiny, hippie Bay Area and Manhattan fly
Seattle and
exactly
Vancouver.
Seattle, precisely. Those people are like, we want to stay rich, but we don't want to feel guilty about it. So only put your money in companies. Only put our money in companies that have a high enough ESG score, and zero deforestation commitments are one means of trying to goose that up in order to look good for the crunchy granola billionaire.
Right. The Marin County set, right. Um,
And
and
that's
so,
the theory of change, right? That like you get the corporations, you incentivize them to do good.
yeah, and they agree to voluntary agreements on this is like a key part to that. And so, one with that theory of change around like the corporate campaigning is that um, if it's not being negotiated and done in good faith, then it's not going to happen. And so that's like just an important thing to flag. Um, and then um, this, some of this is that we need to kind of focus we need to focus more on like some of the systemic change. Like I actually see corporate campaigning as a just a piece in a bigger holistic battle, right? And so there's where we need to put pressure on governments and push for regulation. There's where we need to push for the abolition of some of these companies that are doing some of these egregious practices. There's also where really uh, we really need to put these things into like a popular mindset. There's a paradigm that needs to be shifted. In the 1980s, there was a pretty big save the rainforest movement, right? And rainforests were like very much like a topic that were being, on people's minds. So I think about the, film reference from the 80s that's a cartoon is Fern Gully, right? And so, you know, changing like Americans' popular consciousness around this stuff is also like an important piece. And so all of these approaches are actually ways in which we're going to be able to, back corporations off or stop corporations from doing this, back governments off or, stop governments from doing this. We're in a particularly hard time, as much of an authoritarian moment we think we are in the global north and in the US in particular. Indonesia actually has even more of an authoritarian regime at this point, and has for a long time. And so that's also like another thing that we actually that has to be contended with as well.
Uh, if I let me build from there, and for those in the audience that are unfamiliar with the whole raison d'être of the palm oil industry and the palm oil plantations, it's easy for us to bash them, but when you think about the nutritional needs of the global south, right? This is a region with billions of people. Indonesia itself has what, 330 million inhabitants. Then palm oil is an important staple of the diet of countries in Africa, many Indian regions, Southeast Asia, of course, become globalized. And part of that is
It's
that,
incre- You've seen a lot more of it in Latin America now too.
yes, exactly. And part of it is because there's practical advantages. It can be stored as a solid. It can be, and it's also cheap, right? Like when you look at other seed oils, and one thing that we lose sight of in the global north is the fact that when it comes to our own nutritional needs, the great forests of North America were wiped out 200 years ago and replaced with massive agriculture. right? Like Europe for a long time had been deforested. Ironically enough, the forests are coming back now because of deindustrialization, but and population decline. But if you have a large and growing population that needs to be fed, you're going to need to feed them one way or another. It's very difficult to extract calories for humans from especially protected forest, right? Because the whole point of preserving forests is not just to leave them alone, but eat absolutely everything in it, but to have biomes that remain as pristine as possible. And palm oil produces a great deal of calories. It's there's different forms that it takes, right? Because you've got different products that it gives. It's not a bad solution to the fact that people need to eat, right? Um, the issue is that why do we cut down existing um, old growth forests, rainforests, in order to put up these plantations? Couldn't we find other land to do that? And that's one reason why the deforestation associated with palm oil has decreased. In the core areas of Indonesia and Malaysia, especially Malaysia, they've just shifted away from cutting down and clearing land to using land that repurposing land that's already been in development. There's also a great deal of potential in increasing the productivity of the existing plantations, right? So instead of doubling the size of your plantation, use better techniques, have basically Frankenstein's the hell out of palm oil the same way that the Americans have done to corn. And you can get massive yields. You can feed all of Indonesia with the land that's already, not just Indonesia, but the entire export market, with the land that's already assigned to plantations. The problem there is that those investments often result in wiping out small scale farmers. However, the example of Poland and the survival of household farming through into the period against competition from you know rationalized larger scale Western producers makes me think that done properly, you might be able to make the existing sector productive enough, and that's the sort of solution which is cold blooded and profit oriented enough to make it through the corporate filters, but actually gets us some of what we want from an environmental perspective in terms of preserving existing forests and especially the old growth. Like we do not want Irian Jaya to be one giant palm oil farm.
Yeah. I mean, oh, go ahead. Just not.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I love Fern Gully. Thank you for mentioning that. It's such a good movie. All right, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, talking about Fern Gully, it's like it's a long. What people don't under what I think is like less known about like trying to preserve the rainforest is actually very much what Kuba was saying, is that like it's very much tied to food production. When we saw rainforest campaigns really kick off in like the 80s, it was because they were cutting down rainforests in Central America and Costa Rica for, beef cultivation, right? It's like the first corporate campaigns were against Burger King because they, were using meat sourced from ranches in Costa Rica where rainforests have been cut down. That's actually still the case in Brazil as well. And so food being tied to this deforestation is really an important piece. The other part, which is, we haven't said yet, which is actually an important thing to note on the deforestation, is it's actually a pretty big climate impact. There's actually a lot of carbon stored under that old growth forest. Like I said, there's biodiversity issues. We're seeing a lot of, species being wiped out through this deforestation. There's human rights violations going on, but this is actually a climate issue more than anything else. And so, as they are going in and deforesting rainforests, old growth rainforest for, palm oil production, they're also like letting more and more carbon out into the atmosphere. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Such a shame that this happens to old growth forests. I mean, some of these trees are hundreds of years old. You can't replace them. or you can, but it will take a very, very, very long time. Yeah, I hate to see that in particular. Let's go to another part of the globe here. We're going to talk about the Iran war. How does the Iran war worsen the climate crisis? The war in Iran, is intensifying climate pressure in a region that was already facing extreme water scarcity, rising temperatures, and increasingly severe droughts. The conflict has damaged or threatened critical water infrastructure, including desalination plants and reservoirs, while strikes on oil and chemical facilities have also polluted already vulnerable waterways. In some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, desalination supplies more than two-thirds of the people's water use, making these facilities especially important and especially vulnerable during war. The conflict is also making the underlying climate crisis harder to address. Governments are diverting money, infrastructure, and attention towards the war instead of investing in climate adaptation and resilience. At the same time, the war itself produces substantial greenhouse gas emissions through military operations, burning fuel, destruction, and reconstruction. As the Time puts it, the conflict is yet another stark example of how the logic of war is increasingly colliding with the logic of climate vulnerability. So, my question to you guys is, what does it mean when war is being fought in places where climate change has already made basic resources like water so precarious?
So, as with the development of the Sunbelt cities in the US, the reason why you have Dubai or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia becoming the population centers that they are has to do with the introduction of modern technology. Without air conditioning, without the global logistics chain and all of the technological forces that enable it, Dubai now would look not that different from Dubai 100 years ago, right? There'd be a couple of towns in the Emirates and some scattered populations using age old techniques to stave off the heat and make the most of local water sources. But instead, thanks to abundant energy and the availability of different desalinization technologies, you can get drinking potable water in places where none exists. Turn the sea into tap water. It's great until the bombs start flying and those desalination centers become strategic targets. So you have a extremely fragile infrastructure that's absolutely essential for the preservation and sustainment of human life in the area. That's one reason why these facilities have become such hostages. The GCC countries, Saudi, elsewhere, everyone is concerned that their enemies could just turn off their end all the tap water, make everybody thirsty, and that is a lethal threat to human life. And we'd be talking about millions of people in this scenario. So from a humanitarian scale, we should probably distinguish between the humanitarian effects of environmental degradation and pressure versus the factors that lead to that pressure, right? The Middle East was always, if we're talking about the GCC area, you had very low populations. It was always a very harsh place. Global climate change is making it hotter, but it was already so bad that you can't get that much worse. The bigger vulnerability to the populations there is the infrastructure. And then looking at it from a different perspective, The Iran war may have some extremely positive climate impacts by demonstrating to every advanced economy in the world that Middle East oil is unreliable, that not just Iran, not just the United States, but any regional actor can potentially shut down the Strait of Hormuz, can attack crucial infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or ports or refineries. The Houthis were hitting Saudi refineries for a while. Now they're looking to take control of the Bab al Mandab, like the Strait of Hormuz is becoming more and more of an Iranian property. If you are China, if you are East Asia, then all of a sudden a shift towards less fossil fuels becomes much more attractive. Now, in the short term, as as countries look at what technologies and what infrastructure is already available versus what it would take to get more renewables off the ground to offset your oil thirst with solar or wind. Right now, there's competition for existing sources of fossil fuels, right? Canada has become very attractive because it's a great oil producer. The possibility of Brazilian offshore oil, etc. However, down the road, right, the best oil is no oil. And you might get to the point where, as with the palm plantations in Indonesia, from a strictly lizard brain, reptilian policy and profitability standpoint, it makes sense to go into renewables, which are super cheap and get you away from this supply chain uncertainty. But for the people in the area, the things that they rely on are all at risk. The some of the infrastructure that's getting targeted in terms of roads, dams, bridges, that sort of thing in Iran, not only has a human use, but some of this is involved in maintaining and stabilizing the climate, the ecology of regions in Iran. You destroy it, you can set back efforts to adequately irrigate or supply parts of the country which would otherwise turn into wastelands. I've thought about this question when you posed it, MT, in terms of another great conqueror, another great war in the same region. Before the Mongol invasion, Afghanistan was a center of Islamic civilization. It was not a backwater, but a place with observatories and libraries, and sort of most surprisingly, when I read about it, extensive vineyards. Just these massive, fruitful plantations of grapes, but also other, stone fruits. It was a breadbasket. And all of that was based on an irrigation system that they had inherited from the Persian Empire, thousands of years old. When the Mongols came through, they, in a very Trumpian way, felt unconstrained by any of the laws of war or international opinion. And as some of the greatest resistance to early Mongol expansion occurred in Afghanistan, they decided to make an example of these prosperous city states, and they just wiped them out down to the agricultural system. And Afghanistan has literally never recovered because that human infrastructure had become part of the hydrology, part of the overall ecological cycle that sustained not just human agriculture, but also entire ecosystems, entire biomes fed off of that water and the secondary growth around that. All of that gone and replaced with some of the most barren and challenging terrain in the world. Potentially, we could see something similar as in some cases, the same Persian um, irrigation infrastructure is being destroyed by American bombing.
Just my thoughts on this is mean, I think it's about 90 years since we first started seeing like the Saudis start pumping oil in the Middle East. And so in many ways, and I mean, there's like a couple of different pieces here is that one, they fuel the climate crisis in many ways with, selling oil to everyone that they're selling oil to. And then just as I've been thinking about this, I think a lot about that stat that we talked about earlier and that gets put out a lot. And there's even like organizations which campaign on it that, the Pentagon is the largest emitter. And so, we've seen, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in damage to energy infrastructure across the Gulf, both in Iran and in the Gulf states. And, it's just the level of emissions that are coming from that. We've it's estimated just the first 2 weeks of the war alone, there were like 5 million tons of carbon that were put into the atmosphere. Um, and so, what the war means for the climate crisis is it's just like continuing to put more and more carbon out there. And then it also seems very much like it's like a resource war. It's like now in response to that, we're seeing other parts of the world try and like, you know, put out more, oil production. The US is talking about how to develop Venezuelan oil fields, which have been um, which are notoriously like outdated in the infrastructure in which they have, or you know uh, places in Africa where we're actually seeing a lot. We see a lot of conflict, and part of that is like driven by the desire to drill oil out of the Niger Delta or places like that, and so it is to me, it's very much like the climate crisis and the increasing amount of conflict in which we see in the world are very much tied. We're also seeing like other resources which are in the Middle East in particular, which are scarce, like water. There's increasing conflict, at least war of words between like Turkey and Israel. And like there's a lot of like water reliance that Israel has from, upstream in Turkey. And so I also feel like there's just like seeing more and more like conflict coming. And um as we see the climate crisis worse and worse, and I just think we're going to see a whole lot more of like wars like this. If it's not, and obviously the Strait of Hormuz was a place where it had been coming for a long time, but I feel like we're just going to increasingly see like these conflicts happen more and more, and it's going to be driven by climate change. Even if people in power are not talking about it, it's like a root reason. We often talk about the climate crisis being an environmental issue, but I feel like it's something that actually applies to, you know, inequality. It's tied to like war, all of that. It's like it's bigger than just like an environmental issue. So,
Amen. I think that when you when people are thirsty, starving, desperate, then they lash out, and if they can. If they're also powerless, then they migrate. And we've seen that Europe is not able to accept migration at a level that would adequately address the humanitarian catastrophes all across the Middle East and Africa. Uh, when you look at countries in across the Sahel, these are some of the youngest populations and some of the fastest growing populations in the world, and they're exactly at the places where the water is running out, the deserts are creeping in, and the temperature just keeps going up and up and up. Um, their alternatives are at that level of development, like migration, ISIS, the desert, criminal gangs, the Wagner Group. It's a dismal situation for people who struggle just to survive in it. And those groups, right? We know all the way back to the Bronze Age collapse that desperate peoples that are trying to survive and go wandering, looking for places where they can live because home is no longer an option. Well, they can be a conquering or destabilizing force wherever they go. Um, This is one reason, from a purely selfish perspective, why the global north should be more invested in developmental projects across Africa, especially, but also other sort of young, fast growing regions, because you want the people there to make their mark locally, be take that energy, take the opportunity to um, develop their own countries into producers that can provide a decent, stable, decent quality of life, so that people don't have to go abroad, and that militant groups have a more difficult time finding the recruits that they need to struggle to continue fighting. Instead, I think we're going down the path of Palantir, um, militarized AI. And one reason why all of this drone technology is so attractive is that it's traumatizing for human people, human soldiers, human operators, even if they're sitting in a trailer in Nevada, a
Yeah.
hemisphere away, to vaporize people who are just looking for food and water. But
We've,
robots
al-
will do that.
we've also seen a growth in just security contractor firms as well, both from within the US and abroad, right? Wagner Group, for example. An important thing to note. Um, the other thing I actually, climate change, the climate crisis. I hate calling it climate change. Sometimes it's a bad habit, though. I like to call it the climate crisis. I think that's a more apt description. But the refugee crisis is also, you know, I don't think I have to say that it's also creating, this move towards more authoritarian politics in a lot of global North countries, including this one. And I think that's actually really important to know, is like part of the way in which we're dealing with people who are leaving their home countries to come to the U.S. to work or whatever, is because the economic conditions often perpetuated by the climate crisis is actually forcing them to leave, and then our response is like more ice agents, right? And we're seeing that, in other parts of the world too, and that's also even leading to what you're talking about, Cuba, which is like Palantir, militarized AI on the border, board building. I mean, basic simple thing is like building the wall, right? So, I mean, the refugee migration crisis that's been happening in the world is a direct response to the climate crisis. It's also a response to, like, these conflicts that we've seen in the Middle East, civil war in Syria, or uh, you know what has been the genocide in Gaza, the Israeli war on the Lebanese. So
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that there's one way of addressing the problem, the anxiety that there might not be enough water, food, other resources to go around because of climate um, degradation, is that, well, if there's fewer mouths to feed, dot, dot, dot. And that's something that I've typically heard in Washington, D.C., right? Like, among a subset of my associates, the 50% solution is their preferred resolution to the problem of climate change. If we could just lower the global population by half, then there we go.
it's
Problem solved.
The Thanos solution, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. That hashtag Thanos did nothing wrong.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Hey, one thing I do want to throw out real quick is that there's, U.S. climate movements uh, are often very quiet on these, you know, anti-war, anti-empire issues. You see some of it now, and I will say I feel like younger folks who I've worked with within the climate movement very much went all in in working in anti-genocide movement spaces, and so a big shout out to them. But you don't really see a lot of the big environmental groups, but also like older climate and environmental activists who are like super engaged on matters of, like, war and peace, the genocide in Gaza. And so I do want to just like point out that we're not actually seeing a lot of advocacy or campaigning or organizing around that in those spaces. There's people who have defected and just join the anti-genocide movement, or what have you. But it's just like an important thing to note. And there's like snarky tweets. Hey, there's, no one's going to war over the Strait of Hormuz if there were solar panels there. So, that kind of thing. But there's not real significant organizing or intersectional organizing going on.
I mean, I heard on Chapo they're doing recruiting, I believe. You can play GTA 6 early if you enlist or go for another tour or
Gross.
something. Yeah.
I mean, with like the rising inequality, economic disparity that we're seeing in this country, is like the military is actually, increasingly becoming a way out for people too. So
That's a good point. Three hots and
yeah,
a cot.
the poverty draft, as it's called in at
Hmm.
different periods of time.
And some people don't believe in it. They're like, come on, you're in America. You still have choices. But I think, on the ground, it's kind of a different reality. I Go
Hey,
ahead.
one other thing on this is also interesting to note that the the Pentagon is actually, the Pentagon for a long time has actually been tracking the climate crisis. They have like work groups because they know there's going to be all kinds of national security issues related to it.
Hmm.
Hegseth at the top has basically declared that we need to get rid of, the climate change religion within the Pentagon. I actually just saw a story this week about it was one of the last civilian professor who taught climate science at West Point got fired, and so, despite having to deal with all these contentious issues related to the climate crisis, we're also seeing these fanatics who are, at the top echelons of our government doing everything they can to purge anyone who has anything to do with the climate crisis or calling out on the climate crisis. So I just want to note that as well.
Shame. Um, Now's a good time to hit the like button. Thank you, Sean Moon, for hitting like for us. Um, let's see. Also subscribe if you're not subscribed. Don't just be watching this. It's free. We have a super chat here from Prairie Fire, Nebraska, saying, "As a cattle row crop farmer, I know if we cut the meat industry in half and locked in on staples, we could bring back half the forest, but we lack labor." I don't entirely know what that means. Do you guys know what that means?
Well, one issue for agriculture all across the global north is that no one wants to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It being a farmer, even when there isn't an exploitative structure around you, which is a rare treat, right? Typically, there's a landlord, typically, there's a supplier, typically, there's somebody that's squeezing. But um, even when conditions are good, it's a difficult life. It's not for everyone. Plus, you're far from the city. Um, it's something that's hard to entice young people with options into. What you see in a lot of places is the arrival of immigrants from other countries, other regions that might be more interested in taking that deal, right? Like it doesn't look like a particularly attractive lifestyle if your baseline is Sex in the City, but if your baseline is, you know, Sex in the City, but the city's Mogadishu, then maybe, yeah, like a Midwestern farmer. There's farmers only, right? You can get on the app, you can find yourself a hot milkmaid, and there you go. You have everything you need. So there isn't a problem with getting people into agricultural related labor, especially since in the United States, let's face it, short of being like a proper farmer, mid-century white, own your own land and everything. Agricultural labor is associated with people of color, um, Mexicans, sharecroppers, lots of illegal immigration, undocumented workers. Conditions are terrible. And you have basically the preservation of a plantation mentality on a lot of big farms where the owners treat agricultural labor like the most disposable possible commodity. Could be quite dangerous as well as intense and very low pay. So you need to do something about that. One of the attractions of monoculture, large scale crops, even though they're bad in a gajillion different environmental and nutritional ways is because you can mechanize them more, you rely on less labor, you can get around that problem. But until there's a shift, a rebalancing, so that agriculture gets paid more, agricultural work is compensated in ways that reflect its value, and a greater emphasis is placed on improving the conditions of the workers rather than just the profits of the owners, then yeah, you're going to have that labor problem. And you're going to have instead farmers relying on what brings in the most money and not what's the most sustainable or productive from an ecological perspective.
One thing I want to say real quick in response to Prairie Fire's comment is that, talking about how the meat industry should be cut in half. I mean, part of that is a climate impact. There's animal ag actually has a huge climate footprint. And you guys, I think y'all just did a show like a week or two ago with Will Potter, who wrote the book Little Red Barns, which actually goes into a lot of detail about animal agriculture and how terrible it is from abuse of animals and abuse of workers, but also the carbon footprint. And so it's also worth noting is like part of the reason that we should reduce, meat consumption is that the animal agriculture sector is terrible for the climate and the environment. Just to kind of put that out there as far as another, along with the Pentagon, another huge contributing factor to like carbon emissions.
Great point. We do have a correction. Drunk Dalek in the chat says regarding GTA 6, it was 4 days early. 4 days early, not 2 weeks. That is criminal. And like 100 troops in Georgia got offered, and 20 of them took up the offer. Yeah, so I misremembered that, but 4 days early, really? That's what we're doing now. Hmm. Okay. Just want to put this up here. Scott's a great guest. I am indeed infotained as promised. All
Infotainment, I'm
right.
all about it.
Yeah, we need it. Also, yes, it is shirt and tie Saturday. That's what we do here on What Fresh Hell. A very special What Fresh Hell.
The
So,
Green and Red podcast has actually started wearing collared shirts and ties
really?
as a result of this and when Bob has also been on What Fresh Hell, and he always would wear a very nice suit and that's spreading.
I'm humbled.
Yeah,
I
yeah. We
I
did a shout
feel
out in salute of you, Cuba.
I feel like I read an article somewhere. Suit socialism. I'm here for it, and I'm like, where's my shout out? Right? Like, I feel like I've been carrying that torch from the very beginning, and yet it's all Hassan Piker looks great. Mom Donnie wears a tie. But can a white boy get some love? Not in Donald Trump's America, I guess.
All right. Well, let's get into our next story while we still have our Scott. How is extreme heat exacerbating inequality in urban Africa? So we're going to Africa for our next story. Sub Saharan. Extreme heat is becoming an inequality crisis in African cities, with people living in informal settlements often facing the greatest risks. So, I actually had to look into informal settlements to make sure that that's clear for you guys. They're not the same as slums, but they are similar. These are technical terms, and you should be imagining basically what you know to be a slum. That is considered a derogatory term, though, and so people don't use it as much, also. A new review of 21 studies from across Africa found that extreme heat is associated with illnesses ranging from dehydration and heat stroke to respiratory problems, while also worsening conditions such as infectious disease, cardiovascular illness, and malnutrition. The effects don't come from temperature alone. People living in overcrowded housing with poor ventilation, limited water, limited access to water, inadequate infrastructure, and fewer healthcare resources have fewer ways to protect themselves from extreme heat. the researchers also found evidence of indirect effects, including depression and other mental health problems. That means climate vulnerability isn't simply about who experiences the highest temperatures. It's also about who has the resources to survive those temperatures. So, my question to you guys is, when we talk about climate change, how much do we miss by focusing on temperature and extreme weather instead of asking who has the resources to adapt? Scott.
I mean, I think we're. I mean, this goes back to a little bit of like the climate crisis is like a bigger issue than just emissions and heat waves and floods and superstorms and
Mhm.
things like that. And climate resilience is actually a big buzzword in the environmental nonprofit industrial complex and within environmental and climate spaces. And we're not talking about we talk about climate resilience when it comes to like having better roads for when they flood, or flood barriers, or clearing debris from the forest so they don't burn. Or at least I think that's what the Trump talks about. Anyway, um, but yeah, this issue around um, public health, for example, is like we're what we see in like these African countries is like there's like the public health systems are not very, there's not a lot there, right? And so that's why we're seeing there housing, is like an issue. Air conditioning, forget about it, right? Is like we see that in the Gulf states and we see that in like the US and other parts of the global north, but like, you know, and that's causing like levels of misery and suffering which are like, you know, tracked by probably some, you know, by some small nonprofit somewhere, but or research or think tank or somewhere. But like I think it's actually really important to note that like there's what I would almost call like indirect effects of climate change are going to be like these health problems. They're going to be these economic problems. They're going to be these housing problems, and and also in places with large populations, it's actually even going to like it's going to even be more exacerbated.
Cuba.
So I think that when it comes to African urbanism, the it's the same development as you see across Asia, across Europe. Before that, populations move from the countryside to the cities when there's something to do in the cities, and there's enough agricultural surplus, so not everybody needs to be working on the land. In many important parts of Africa, I'm thinking specifically of Nigeria, but we could go to throughout that region, Cameroon, um, across the Sahel. The countryside is also incredibly dangerous. You have not just different types of political or Islamist movements, but uh, some of these groups take the form of just insane cults built around charismatic leaders. Lord's Resistance Army was one, and simple brigandage, right? Just organized criminal violence on a large enough scale, and the level of development is so low that we're not talking about robbing banks, we're talking about stealing herds of cattle, we're talking about stealing children. Towns and villages get wiped out in northern Nigeria on an almost daily basis. It's quite scandalous. Right now, there's a group that has taken several hundred hostages. The Nigerian government is trying to figure out how to try to get them back, whether to pay a ransom or to fight their way in. So the level of vulnerability is extremely high. And I feel as though the great project of the international community should be to ensure that there are a few Wakandas out there that demonstrate that an African developmental model can succeed, and that if you stay put and invest in your locality, you can have improving life with safety, security, prosperity, and self-respect. You don't have to migrate. You don't have to engage in political violence. You don't have to become one of the brigands. China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, has introduced an alternative model and alternative potential for development for African countries, but it involves plugging into these international supply chains that have other environmental consequences, which we'll talk about with the green transition and Brazil, the minerals boom. There's been an attempt by the sort of Gates Foundation global NGO industrial complex to find ways that I would say don't do anything about poverty in Africa, but just make it more bearable and picturesque. You don't develop, but you keep people where they are with mosquito netting and some basic amenities that will make their day-to-day lives a little bit more bearable, but don't lead to more local self-resilience, don't give hope for a better future to the burgeoning younger generation. I mean, I think in Mali, the average age, and I'll verify this, but I believe that I heard that it was in the teens, like 16, 17 was the average age of a Malian. So these are children we're talking about. We're talking about countries full of children that are experiencing the most acute physical stresses and failures of governance, security, and development. Those conditions are going to leave a mark, right? We're talking about millions of people who will grow up with trauma as their babysitter. Not good, right? Not good for the future of mankind, not good for the future of these regions, especially since, due to the aging populations elsewhere, this is going to be a bigger and bigger proportion of the global human population, right? Like 100 years from now, you're going to have to reckon with the fact that a significant portion, maybe 20% of the global population, have been traumatized since birth by environmental pressure and insecurity. I don't think that we're at all able to reckon with that, except to the extent that people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk just dream of a white genocide, but for not white people.
Mm, wow. Well, when I was researching this story, one of the things I found interesting in the article I found, which I'll share in the comments, was that they mentioned depression as one of the effects of the climate crisis. And it's as if we talk about the global south as if they don't have any interiority. They're just populations or something, a bunch of widgets. And I, I know you're not psychologists, and I know, this is venturing also into media criticism. Why do you think those kinds of effects aren't discussed very much? The mental health
I think
aspect of enduring a climate crisis. Mhm.
I
Yeah,
don't
I
think
don't
this
think they.
can. Please
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
You go first. You go first.
Okay. I don't think this can be blamed on white people. Let me very quickly, rush in with that. The Don't forget that in most of the world, there remains extreme taboos about discussing mental illness, especially admitting that you have issues with your own mental health. It's associated with deficiency. It can be a mark of shame, not just for yourself, but for your family. Um, these, in many places, right, when people talk about themselves, rather than being in this candid, confessional, diagnostic mode, it's a hype video, right? Like, I'm so great. Let me show off. Let me brag. Look at my money. Look at my cars. Look at my women. it's easier to express if you're dissatisfied and you're not trying to present a socially boosting face, then anger is much more socially acceptable than admitting depression or despair, etc.
Outrage, outrage.
Outrage, exactly. Also, when mental illness reaches a large enough saturation, it becomes invisible to the people in the society experiencing it. This struck me watching videos from Gaza 20 years ago. There were all of these interviews with Palestinians who had been living under in the siege conditions for decades and had experienced another wave of bombings. This was around the time that white phosphorus was the great scandal. It became clear that everyone being interviewed had PTSD. Every single one. And of course they did. Absolutely. Everything about their way of life, the conditions that they were living in, would contribute to inducing PTSD in everyone, regardless of their baseline mental states, their biological predisposition, how happy their family life was, the quality of their childhood. Doesn't matter. Living in Gaza full time will give you PTSD eventually. Similarly, late stage communism, the experience of going through that in the Soviet Union or surviving the Great Leap Forward in China, screws people up, gives them depression, causes all kinds of anxiety issues. But because it's universal, no one recognizes it. They just take it to be a part of the human condition, an essential component of human nature. So I think that there is part of the reluctance to discuss the mental health impacts on the populations we're talking about, especially in urban Africa, is because they themselves, the people experiencing it, have strong reservations about discussing that publicly. Sense of shame is holding them back, often because of the collective cultural attitude, the language of therapy, the language of mental health, of wellness that is hegemonic. It's just everywhere. It's part of the oxygen we breathe in the global north, but that might not be available to them, right? They might not have social media constantly asking them, fill out this questionnaire to find out what flavor of autism you have. They might have strong barriers to that kind of information. So they might not be able to diagnose themselves or describe what the phenomenon are that they're experiencing. Or they might have alternative narratives at their disposal, ones that are much more spiritual, ones that may have to do with right, like the presence of evil forces in the world. We're talking about, Africa is home to all kinds of traditional forms of spirituality, as well as burgeoning, forceful movements of Christian and Islamic missionary activity, which often include overt supernatural element close to the surface. So you might have Westerners don't talk about it because often they find it a little bit embarrassing. It's a place where a connection is very difficult to make between the local population and sort of the secular, um, you know, suit socialists that might be coming in from the outside. And all of this leads to a challenge of getting that data, getting that information, and being able to address that problem, right? Like, how do you work on a problem which the person experiencing it can't even
Mhm.
articulate?
That's a really good point. Scott is going to jump soon, but he wanted to say something about this and then maybe
Yeah.
something else to close out. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one, I totally agree with Kuba. I mean, we're not talking about depression and trauma in, the global South. We don't talk about trauma and depression here, right? Suicides are up, addiction is up, and part of that is a result of trauma and depression that folks deal with. So I feel like people care even less about, you know, people who are having like depression issues or mental issues in like Africa. I mean, and the only other thing I'd like to add into this is We have this global. I like how you said that global nonprofit industrial complex, which actually deals with development issues and which deals with like reliance. And we've also had mechanisms in place in the U.S., which I actually like things like USAID, which I actually consider to be like soft power for the U.S. in order to combat during the Cold War, the Soviet
Mhm.
Union or what have you, probably was still a pretty effective tool, being that the U.S. seems to want to challenge Belt and Road with the Chinese. But that's all been abolished. AID has basically been abolished. And I think that was a one mechanism that we had to sort of put in to like deal with these effects, both direct and indirect, of climate change, including like the mental health piece. And so we're seeing like this steady removal of systems that had been in place for like many decades to help people, um even if it was like at some minimal level, like contend with public health issues, mental health issues, housing issues, that sort of thing. So I just want to, and obviously economic inequality issues, which is like way out of proportion. Actually, preparing for this, I actually looked up the 20 poorest countries in the world, and they were all African countries with the exception of Afghanistan and Yemen. And so it's just like
Mm.
just an important thing to note is that like the poverty, the war on the poor is just completely escalating right now, and I don't even know how much people are aware of that.
Excellent point. Where can we find you, Scott?
You can find me at greenandredpodcast.org. You can also find me at Sparky with an I 1969 on X, also on Blue Sky. I'm
Excellent.
there less. I'm a little bit more active on X, and also Green and Red Podcast on X is actually pretty active too. That's actually the more active one.
And you're on YouTube.
And we're on YouTube. Yeah. With greenandredpodcast.org, you can find our YouTube. You can find we're on all the audio platforms.
Hmm.
Our website, we post a lot. You can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/greenredpodcast. If you really want to support the Green and Red podcast, and we have great stuff going on these days. We actually just did a great interview with Dave Zirin about his new biography on Howard Zinn. We
Ooh,
just did an interview yesterday, which is not out yet, with Adam Johnson, who from Citations Needed,
love
who
that guy.
just wrote a book on how to sell a genocide. We got a lot of great stuff coming up. We're gonna do a Dolly Parton episode next week. So
Okay.
yeah,
That's
we're
exciting.
busy
I'm in for
guys.
the
We're busy
Dolly.
guys. It's all Bob. He's highly motivated. So
All
He's
right.
still in
Thanks so much.
Texas.
he's in Ohio now.
Oh,
He's retired, and he lives in Northeast Ohio. He lives in Youngstown area.
the
Nice.
so very North Texas.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that is exactly how he describes it.
Thanks so much for joining us, Scott. There we go.
See y'all later. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Good guy. Good man. That's Scott. Appreciate
The
you, Scott.
I can't
Mhm.
call him Sparky.
Yes, only I can because we went to the prom together. So let's see. Let's head into our last story of the day. Will the green transition create a new mining boom in Brazil? A favorite of the left because of Lula
Lula. Hmm.
and
Bolsonaro. Oh, Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks.
yes.
Yes, yes, of
So
course. Yeah, the Brazil is it's a little bit like what I was describing in Africa, that we look for a champion, like a country in the region that can deliver development and a more optimistic future for its people as an alternative to migration or some type of adjustment that requires the um, participation of the global north, right? It's
mhm.
better solutions are ones that can come indigenously, come from local resources and local populations. The problem is that industrialization requires industry, and industry is often environmentally destructive and dirty and exploitative. The one reason why there's such pressure for increased mining, and specifically we're talking about some of the rare earth minerals and other specific substances that are necessary for electronics, for the essential components that go into sustainable energy technology, smartphones, you name it. All of the stuff that the newest generation of technology relies on. Right now, China has disproportionate control over that sector, partly because it's polluting. So many Western countries were more than happy, developing countries as well, to let China take that relatively low value stage of uh, electronics manufacturing off their to-do list, right? Like, so we don't think about it anymore. We just pretend that that pollution isn't taking place. The Chinese are our solution. What China did then was apply, rather than, I think that there's a talent story here, which is what I wanted to get at. When you have capable, brilliant, first-rate minds in the United States, they gravitate towards tech and finance because that's where the money is. And so you have hypertrophied um, tech firms in Silicon Valley, way too powerful finance in Manhattan. In China, the government is able to identify sectors that may not have the resources at the time to reward globally competitive talent, but require it in order to make breakthroughs, in order to progress. That's what they did with rare earth mining and refining. And right now, their technology is the best in the world. No one else can do it as well as they do. However, because of that, they can shut off those supplies, hence mining in Brazil, hence Greenland,
Mm.
hence Canada. Everywhere, um, companies are looking for non-Chinese sources for these minerals to get away from that potential bottleneck, to eliminate that leverage from the PRC. Now, one question is, where will Brazil get the technology? China doesn't want to share it, obviously. So would it come from a partnership with Western companies, Western governments that will develop this technology and try to compete with the standards of Chinese rare earth refining? Not only that, but you need to have a tariff scheme to prevent the Chinese from dumping those minerals at exactly the time that your companies are taking off, so that they'll be wiped out. They won't be able to profit. And then you lose your investment, you lose the nascent sector, and China preserves its monopoly after you've wasted all this money. That is all challenging. We don't know if mining will take off in Brazil. We also don't know to what extent which of these minerals is going to become a durable requirement um, for electronics. For instance, there was a lithium boom associated with the development of Tesla. You need those
Hmm.
lithium ion batteries in order to power EVs. It got so bad that there was arguably some Muscovite fingerprints on an attempted coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales
Hmm.
in order to secure the lithium deposits of Bolivia. A couple of years ago, China figured out how to make better batteries with sodium. Don't need lithium anymore.
Mm.
That's gone now. There's still some applications, some use cases where lithium is better than the sodium-based batteries that China's rolling out, but those can be met, right? Like that demand can be met with existing lithium sources. There's no need to go after poor Evo Morales, right? Like they can keep that Bolivian lithium in the ground. And this is something that it's become something of a common story that Western economies, Western companies develop technology that looks great, but is expensive, resource intensive, requires some inputs that are difficult to source. China observes it, gets its hands on a few copies, takes it apart, and then competes not by doing it better, but by finding technical solutions within the problem stack that make their product more competitive. So their AI is not faster, but it is much, much cheaper and less energy intensive, less resource intensive, almost as good.
Mhm.
Similarly, when they look at batteries, their problem isn't, well, how do we get enough lithium? It's how do we make a better battery? One reason why the West is having, especially the United States, is having such a hard time competing with China is because when you look at the material science fields in the U.S., STEM, engineering, chemistry, physics, half the experts are Chinese at this point at U.S. universities. Right? The students are, you don't want to give more student visas to Chinese, so you're relying on other foreigners to fill the seats. The U.S. doesn't produce its own specialist scientific technical class, and that knowledge used to be brought in by foreigners. If you have a Trump-like immigration regime, do you think they want to come here anymore? Do you think the ones that are already here feel comfortable being here and aren't like looking up, how do I get to Canada ASAP? I have a family. Please, please, please don't let them deport me. I think ICE knows where I live. Um, you're going to lose all of the human resources and ingenuity that you need in order to become competitive, in order to solve these problems. I think one reason why there's so much elite buy-in to AI is the hope that just like the threshing machine and the industrial and the agricultural combine helped reduce the need for sharecroppers and agricultural workers, AI will eliminate the need for engineers and scientists. And you can just be a money guy who owns the system and tells it, invent me a new battery that doesn't rely on lithium. My guess, I'm betting on a billion Chinese. So we'll have to see how the next phase of the evolving global economy develops. There's many questions right now that won't have their answers until some stable multipolarity emerges and companies, individuals, states, and governments have enough wherewithal to begin making big planning decisions. I think it's too soon to tell whether what the consequences will be for Brazil, especially since Lula is old.
Mm.
Bolsonaro has a son that's already making trouble. And this friction, right, alteration between left and right governments, constant domestic conflict between two different polarized populations, that also gets in the way of the economic planning, which might get you to a booming mining industry with its extremely long investment timeframes and schedules.
Hmm. Um, so I did have a summary. You skip that.
Oh, sorry.
That's fine. Let me just show my notes in case anyone had some issues following it. The green transition does increase demand for rare earths, which is, I don't know, what do you call that? An odd juxtaposition, a contradiction, irony?
Paradox,
There.
irony.
Okay. Some of these, the foreign investment is flooding in mostly from the US and Australia, and they're considering fast tracking some of these. contracts to mine, but they may not. Like there's hundreds of places they could mine, but maybe only a handful will be successful as mines. Hmm. All right. Well, also, we have the indigenous territories which are being encroached upon. This mining could lead to deforestation, water pollution, toxic waste, and other impacts. And of course, they also have their own, I forget what we call it here, but you have to do the environmental assessments first. But obviously, people find ways to get around that anyway. Um, so yeah, the fossil fuel transition is not an extraction free transition. Does
Well,
AOC know that when she talks about a Green New Deal?
uh, all of I'd push back on that,
Okay.
because the reason why you have this mining boom in Brazil, this potential mining boom in Brazil, I'll believe it
Yeah.
when I see it.
Okay.
Uh, there's similar talk about developing rare earth mines for these strategic minerals in Canada. Greenland is being proposed as another site. When after Suitgate with Zelensky, Ukraine was forced to sign a deal giving the United States 50% of its strategic minerals.
Hmm.
These minerals are not hard to find. It's not as though there's only a few sources in the world and you have to go there. You have to do this in the Amazon, or else we
Okay.
can't build solar panels. No, no, it's everywhere, basically. It's a question of, do you want to deal with the massive environmental downside? Do you want to make the huge investments? Do you want to do all that hard stuff? And the answer before these amplifying trade disputes with China was no, let the Chinese handle it. And they
Hmm.
have, and they can, right? China could supply everybody all of the rare earth minerals, all of the strategic minerals they needed forever. Um, the industry is already there. It's becoming more and more efficient. It's becoming greener and greener. I mean, relatively speaking, right? Um, but they're really pioneering this field. The reason why anybody else is looking at mining is because of anxiety about that dominance, not about any or additional sources or supplies, right? The fear is that Xi Jinping, sitting on a throne made of gallium, will tell the United States, yeah, we're not going to sell you any more gallium because you need it to make Tomahawk missiles. Would you like some shredded gallium on top of your Peking duck? Right? There's no shortage of this stuff. It's just a matter of who controls it. So if we could get around the political obstacles, right, the security concern with Chinese control of rare earth
Hmm.
metals, make an actual deal where we were planning global supply of different crucial inputs, increasing efficiencies like that, then we could we would not need to touch the Amazon rainforest. The issue is the political and security competition that makes that type of coordination impossible, and that
Hmm.
um, makes the United States feel like, oh my God, we can't just let China handle this. Um, Frankly, I think that more specialization is the solution, not a vulnerability. But that requires a very different architecture for international cooperation and trade than available now. Um, Even what we had before with globalization, Clintonism, the Trans Pacific Partnership is better than this circumstance where Trump is just blowing up every single international economic agreement. Everybody's scrambling to try to find alternatives. And in the meantime, um, everyone's trying to arm up and build out their defense industrial complex so that um, they can protect themselves not only against the old bad guys that the United States was supposed to keep down, but also from the new bad guy, which is the United States itself.
Hmm.
Um, so that the trade-off here, it's exactly the same way that the military disappears into discussions of carbon emissions. We don't want to acknowledge how destructive and disgraceful the size of the military industrial complex is, the amount of damage it does environmentally, and all of the missed opportunities from this needless level of global confrontation and conflict.
Hmm. Question from Sean Moon: is the processing of rare earth minerals required for the production of certain magnets? The answer to that is yes. Are these specific magnets required to build AI data centers as well as all manner of high tech weaponry? I do know that this does have state security implications. So, what can you tell us about how these rare earth minerals are used in that way?
So, there are rare earth minerals involved in virtually every electronic component.
Hmm.
A lot of them take the form of magnets of various sizes, shapes, and intensities. These are foundational to everything from cell phones to routers to network equipment to guided missiles. The do AI data centers need rare earth minerals? Absolutely, yes. There are certain configurations of rare earth magnets that are only produced by China, including a couple that go into the F-35. So the F-35 program was developed with very specific requirements about American or allied production. There was not supposed to be anything coming in from China. But when they built it, it turned out that subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors had a supplier that produced this one essential component, and that supplier was Chinese, and that's the only one. That's the only place you're going to get it. So they were issued waivers rather than um, rather than told to find alternatives because those alternatives didn't exist. The same is true of electronics. Now, China makes a lot of money exporting this, and they're also smart. They know that if they cut off the electronics industry immediately and suddenly, then there'll be a scramble to find alternatives, and that'll motivate uh, things like building up mines in Brazil. Right? It's a kind of you can only use it once, really, type of leverage. Better to hold that threat looming over everyone's head than bring it down prematurely. Especially since with this war, the United States is using up so many of its stockpiles of these minerals, right? So many of the systems that were built with them are now shrapnel in the Iranian countryside. So there's going to be a need to replace those stockpiles, which means export earnings for China. Um, Now, for the civilian side, those minerals are used in components. The magnets are very obvious cases where it's like this is rare earth, this is from China, and the Chinese producing it know that there's going to be a military application. Um, but many of the rare earths used in data centers come into the supply chain as inputs to build basic components, chips and things. Um, those are commodities that are just exported in massive quantities and form the backbone of the Chinese export economy anyway. So they're not going to be quick to shut those off. You shut that off, you bring the Chinese economy to a standstill as well. Um, so I'm less concerned, and I think that the tech sector is less concerned about who controls those mines than the military side. But at this point, through Palantir, through the level of government contracting by Amazon Web Services, by Google, through the different AI companies, Claude, Anthropic. The line between a national security company and a tech company is becoming harder and harder to define.
I am surprised to hear that about China's economy. I thought their economy ran on Shein and Temu. The
The
way people talk.
Yeah, well, people see um, the experience of Americans uh, with the economy, right? With the global economy, is what they buy and consume. So they're
Mm,
thinking a lot less of all of the companies, all of the activity that is invisible, that never
mhm,
comes up in their feed, that never shows up on packaging. But if you think about the Timu, for instance, all of the stuff that you get through them
mhm,
has some fundamental component of its value derived from the tech systems and logistic systems that make its manufacture and distribution possible. So Timu is a massive consumer of rare earth minerals and of technology in general, because
mm,
that's its infrastructure. That's the backbone which makes all of your shopping possible. So, it doesn't matter that what you may be buying is a Punisher face mask or a thick set of knives that, will really show your girlfriend that you're the alpha in the relationship. Um, right? Like, I don't know what people buy on Temu, but the all of that may be simple commodity products that haven't touched a lick of neodymium, but it's brought to you, by the letters NE, um, DY, TR, right? Like, and other exotic components of the periodic table.
mhm. I mean, I can tell you that China's logistics are pretty incredible, honestly.
Oh
And
yeah.
they've been doing what they've been doing for so long. There was talk of India becoming some kind of competitor, but I mean, you can't beat that infrastructure. You can't beat those logistics. It's really, really tough.
Also,
Um, mhm,
um, there's a developmental legacy attached to socialism that China benefited from, Poland benefited from,
mhm,
um, which and India has not, and it still suffers the weight of an unreformed feudal persistence. Like, China, many catastrophic mistakes were made during the early period of the People's Republic, the Great Leap Forward catastrophe, the Cultural Revolution, really, really bad. Cost of human lives, massive. But some fundamental markers were shifted in an irrevocably progressive direction. Literacy went from being a luxury to being universal. Basic education, similarly, accessible everywhere. The basic nutrition, basic health. So by the 1980s, by the Deng Xiaoping period, the Chinese population, mass population, was very suitable to be industrial workers and to train up to become engineers and eventually researchers to push the technical frontier forward. India is weighed down by the fact that there's this massive countryside which is in the hands of large scale private landholders that have an absolutely feudal and extractive relationship with their tenants, have no interest in seeing their tenants learn how to read, let alone become
mhm,
the engineers that will stand up competing Timu. You have a middle class that's massive, right? Hundreds of millions of people, but that is always going to be weighed down by an unreformed countryside of grinding exploitation, you know, primitive, obscuritist levels of superstition and ignorance, and all of the pressure that comes with that.
Hmm. Well, we are nearing the end of the show, and I am realizing again for the first time how grateful I am that you are in my life and I can ask you questions anytime. So,
Aww.
I have been saving some comments from the chat. We're going to speed run them. I'm going to read a few, and then you can offer some commentary, and then we'll wrap things up. So quickly, Red Dogger says, "Ask Jason would people buy into you." Which, you know what? Yes. um, Alf and I were having a quick back and forth about these sodium batteries. China applied larger capacity NA batteries to cars. If I'm not mistaken, they are in household disposables. I too enjoy the idea of these sodium batteries, NA being sodium, not Narcotics Anonymous. This is a very educational show. We went through a lot of the periodic table for you today. Um, so next, Sune says, he's our mod, by the way. The US has plenty of rare earth. We just need to be willing to get down into the strip mines. Very interesting that he says we,
Indeed.
as he is not American, as far as I know. He is a Great Dane.
Well, maybe he recognizes that the Americans won't do the strip mining themselves, right? Like we're gonna have to
Oh,
go in and get it for them. After all, they wouldn't, right? Let's face it.
yeah.
If it's going to be dirty and dangerous, then they're going to, and low skilled, then they're going to use undocumented Latin American labor. If it's dirty,
Mhm.
dangerous, and high skilled, then they're going to use documented Asian labor, right? Like,
Appalachians? No, still not the
yeah.
Appalachians. Yeah.
Well, it's actually a little like I was talking about India.
Mhm.
In the U.S., there's considerable forces on the right that kind of also want to keep the mass American population ignorant and unhealthy because if they
Mhm.
find out too much, then they're going to become even more ungovernable.
Mhm.
Uh, During the Cold War, after the Sputnik scare, especially, there was a reversal of typical U.S. underinvestment in education, and instead this massive boom, um, massive push towards science and engineering, and that's where you got many of the late 20th century greats of American tech coming out of that generation. And since then, right, like rather than sustaining that energy or returning to that model, starting with Reagan and at state governments especially, there was a recognition that like, well, the voters that are coming out of this are more demanding, more difficult. The teachers are getting uppity. Let's talk about private school vouchers. And the one thing that the U.S. has always been bad at is creating cross-class coalitions
Mhm.
where the people who might have used the public schools to get out. I mean, we're not even talking about get out. We're talking about people who went from one form of industrial labor aristocracy, industrial
Mhm.
labor, middle class comfort to a professional, technical, scientific
Mhm.
class comfort. They don't recognize that that pipeline was undermined and that they need that in place because once you have climbed it yourself and you're the boss, you need to hire people that are still on that ladder and have those skills in order to keep your business viable, in order to keep making breakthroughs. And starting in the 90s, or perhaps even earlier than that, the attitude was, well, we don't need to keep our own ladder because our ladder is China, India, the rest of the world, all of the people clamoring to get into our colleges and universities.
Hmm. All right, let's get through some more comments. We have a comment from this handsome guy. This is from Cuba. This is a correction. Median age in Nigeria is 15.2, and Mali is 16.4.
Imagine
Um,
that, right?
that's
Median
awesome.
means that that's the half or younger than that.
Mm-hmm.
So half of the population of Niger is 15 or younger.
Yeah.
Think about um, think about what that does to an entire society, right? It's a country of children, and
Mm-hmm.
because of the endemic violence, there's a shortage of guardians and teachers and protectors because they're constantly getting killed or chased out or brutalized in other ways. So what happens to these children growing up? What are their prospects? Right? Like how do they enter the world?
Mm, great point. We actually have more commentary on your appearance. Here, Sune says you look better than Hank Pecker. Hyperverbal says, agreed, Kuba's much more authentic. As nice as Hank looks, he looks styled as an unrumpled academic. Interesting. Charles Ghost says, so much
Yeah, he
beard
got that
objectification.
way walking out of wardrobe. I got that way waking up this morning.
You sleep in a suit, I'm convinced.
Mm.
Charles Ghost says, so much beard objectification. My eyes are up here, comrade. We had another one. Let me just pull up this. Kuba, I'm glad to see you and that the beard is returning. After all, I started a run in Crusader Kings 3 with the leader of Poland modeled after your bearded visage.
I I I think that may be the nicest thing that anyone has ever said about me.
It's
Thank
very
you.
nice.
I'm I'm deeply moved. I only hope that I will be known as a good king and that my legacy will ring on, bringing honor to my
Hmm,
Slavic descendants.
here we go. Canadian Socialista says Cuba needs his beard back or I'm not listening. Throwing a strop, as the Brits say. Very
The,
upset there.
you may have to negotiate that with Summer.
Prairie Fire, Nebraska says Cuba was spot on with his agricultural labor analysis. So we have an endorsement there.
Validation.
Validation. Sune notes this happens internally. Most refugees globally are internal refugees.
That's absolutely correct. You'll sometimes see a distinction made in the terminology between refugees that are strictly marked as those people who are crossing international borders and internally displaced peoples, IDPs, for people who have migrated within their own country to escape war or disaster. But when you look at what we mean by refugees, which means people forced from their communities, forced out of their lives because of these large scale catastrophes, um, yes, most people stay within their own countries. There's significant barriers and obstacles to trying to cross borders looking for refuge or safety.
Hmm. Oh, great point. Prairie Fire, Nebraska also says the current Sudan civil war is partially climate change related. The ranch land is turning to desert and they are moving into the farmland to the south.
There's another vector that's true, but there's another vector for the conflict, which I think is even more tightly related to climate change, which is the intervention of Saudi Arabia and the UAE backing opposite sides of the conflict. Both of them signed agreements with different factions of the Sudanese government or the RSF, giving them rights to large agricultural territories along the Nile and its tributaries. Saudi and the Emirates realize that they have a food security problem. They are interested in water as well, right? And they are interested in using Sudan as their breadbasket, especially as conditions worsen
Mm.
and tighten globally.
Being a breadbasket is big responsibility. That's Ukraine's role, also historically. So here, Charles Ghost says, I was listening to a piece about the Nepal flood on NPR, and the conversation seemed to be all about how to cope with global warming and nothing really about how to stop it from getting worse. That's a liberal thing, isn't it?
Well, uh, the sad reality is that um, we're past the point of preventing it from getting worse. Even
True.
if we ended all carbon emissions today, which we won't, but even if we did, there would be a period where conditions would continue to deteriorate because there's so much carbon in the atmosphere. And not only that, but we've crossed certain thresholds. So as the permafrost melts in Canada, Siberia, it releases methane, which is much more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. It's less stable in the atmosphere, but much more potent. So the climate change melts the permafrost, which causes more climate change, which melts more permafrost. So we're already in these positive feedback loops that guarantee us a really rough ride. Um, and the question isn't, will there be adjustment to climate change? The question is, how will it take place? And basically, there's team economic planning and shifts in consumption, changes to the economy versus team non-white genocide.
Hmm. Let's speed run these last few comments here. Mr. Crash says, how are we going to get corporations to stop climate change when we can't get them to stop doing Jim Crow era minstrel Halloween costumes? Perhaps that is a rhetorical question. Uh, Organize. That would be the answer Scott would give, I'm sure. Thinking Man 2 says MT needs her own show like L Train with MT. Get on board if you're going left. Okay. Get on board if you're going left. That's cute though. Reclaim the sign says hashtag Fern Gully. I say hell yeah. Political economy wanted to know if Scott was for degrowth. I don't know. We will have to ask him, or you will have to listen to Green and Red podcast with Scott Parkin and Bob Pazenko. Prairie Fire also had this comment. The biggest issue is the lack of humidity. High winds combined with prolonged heat waves reduces humidity, which allows fires to spread more quickly. If you can get dew, it makes life easier. He
That's
says
absolutely
maybe.
true.
Yeah, there's just not enough moisture in the air. Everything is just a matchstick at that point. Um, Lumpin' Larry says, I love maps, more maps. I did have a map that I put up briefly. And, if we do a part 3, please let us know what you want the topic to be. And we'll be sure to include maps. Scott Parkin says, pirate flags. Very nice. PE says, I'm very special. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Focus on the show.
That's the when you're not around. Are these very special episodes? No, no. That's just what fresh hell.
It's just what fresh hell. That's true. Juanito says, I hope Cuba addresses the world's greatest heist, that being the 65 billion barrels transfer from Venezuela to the US. Is that going to be included on a future episode of What Fresh Hell?
Yeah, well, it's certainly something I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, that was quite a mugging that took place there. Canadian Socialista, I love this intro music. That is a big thank you to Jason,
Hmm.
but also
Yeah.
to Quinn for putting together the intro. I love it too, honestly. Um, Chat, please give a big congratulations to MT for her team winning the NYC Double Dutch Championship. I don't know where Jason got this double Dutch thing from. I guess because I'm black and when I was a kid, I wore my hair in barrettes. He thinks it's interesting to jump around with barrettes on and smack yourself in the head with them. Um, Yes, thank you for the congratulations. Please don't adjust your sets. This is an MT production, so the special effects will be of higher quality than you're used to. I like that we're doing the delayed applause thing. That's just me scrambling behind the scenes. And now it's just a thing that we're doing. And I appreciate that you guys are appreciating it. Once again, Sean Moon recommends you hit the like button. What should people do if they're audio listeners and they're not on YouTube?
Then you should leave us a comment or a note, rate 5 stars,
Mhm.
and go to our Patreon so Jason can keep up with my tie collection.
Hey, Jason's 5 cent ties from the Tiangus. He's got quite a collection of shirts and ties, and I enjoy what you guys do together on the regular What Fresh Hells. So I hope you guys
Monday,
enjoy
Monday, Monday.
Monday. You just don't sleep, my friend. It's just
Oh, and
you growing
Tuesday
a beard and you
is
being here. Uh-huh.
and Tuesday is our episode with or what? Oh, is it Wednesday? Um, on the 2nd of September, we've got Danny Bessner on, and that should make for interesting conversation.
You're on that show?
I mean, have you heard differently? Like, I got the invite,
I
but
mean, and that's gonna be a good one. And I love, love, love Daniel Bessner. He's from Queens too, and he talks really fast. I like that. Um, wait, no, Jason needs some rare earth so he can generate some electricity over there. He needs you to join Patreon so he can get the rare earths. Uh, otherwise, I think we're good. Did you want to say anything else in closing?
um, Hassanabi, don't let all of this calumny get you down. You're the most handsome boy. Please put me on your podcast.
That is, you know what? That's perfect. And we are
Out.